Maybe let's try to structure this a bit and list the main benefits of actually using Jamstack.
Right.
If we were to build software today and we want to use Jamstack, what are we getting in maybe five short points or 6 short points?
Right. So number one would most likely be the performance, because the performance is really unparalleled, mostly because we only serve static files and we have everything pre-built. So there's no way we can ever achieve that with pages built at the request time, which, I mean, of course you can cache everything, but caching is hard, and caching is also, it requires a lot of effort. And generally speaking, to get similar performance to what is in Jamstack, you of course can do that. You can get super fast and super good performance with basically any technology, but it just requires much more effort than it does with Jamstack. Jamstack basically has the performance by default with everything.
So it's built for performance, and
it's basically built for performance, because we serve everything that's, again, pre-built, static, so there's no work to do.
Right.
We just get everything right off the bat. There's no usually the time to first byte with something that has to be cached first and generated is much higher than Jamstack's, because we still have to do some work on the server at some point.
Of course. So would I be right to say that with Jamstack we have to try really hard to ruin the performance, while with the monolithic architecture we have to try really hard to get the performance?
You could say that, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Of course, that would probably be the case for starting out with the project, because as time go by, it's really easy to mess up performance of basically everything.
Of course, that's the usual of development. Yeah. So, what about security? Is it better with Jamstack? Is it?
Yeah, I would say that this is a good second point, because the security is basically by nature of Jamstack, and the fact that everything is decoupled and everything basically lives in a completely separate world, you could say. The surface for attacks is much more like there's not that much of an attack surface as there usually is. If you would have some monolithic example, by gaining access to an admin panel or maybe to a database, you could probably affect many parts of the system at once. It would be pretty devastating. Whereas with Jamstack, even if someone would to access your CMS, whether that would be if they deleted your Google Docs that you use for content, or they would get access to your headless CMS, they could change a lot. They could even delete your data, but first of all, there would probably be backups from either Google or the headless CMS that you're using that you didn't even have to care about in the first place.
Because they're the default thing.
Yeah, they're just there. And the second part is that everything that you already deployed is there, because those are static files that cannot be really manipulated or changed or deleted from the CMS part. So you're pretty safe there.
Okay, so it's more secure and it has less vectors of attack. And going back to my analogy for the Lego bricks, we're probably safer just taking out, if someone takes out one brick, it doesn't mean that the entire structure collapses.
Right. So maybe like a quick example, like for example with WordPress, if someone would to get like through your authentication system, they would probably be able to, let's say you have users on your site that authenticate, they would usually probably authenticate with your WordPress setup as well. And if someone would to gain access to it or break through your authentication, they would not only be able to impersonate your users, but would probably be able to gain the admin rights for your admin panel, because it's the same authentication system in place. And if they were able to gain access to your admin panel, there's a high risk that they would be able to do something with your database. They would be able to change everything with your front end. with the API, basically everything.
Yeah, of course.
Whereas with Jamstack, if we had like an authentication system, it would probably be either as a microservice that we would make ourselves or a third party. In both cases, if it's a third party, they probably have the domain knowledge and much better security than something that you host yourself. And for the microservice that you would write yourself, it would still be pretty bad if someone, of course, got through it. But if they did, maybe your users would be compromised, which would be bad enough. But at the same time, nothing like your content or your hosting, rather not hosting, but like there are deployments that are already there, displaying content, or your CMS would have nothing to worry about because they have nothing to do with your authentication system, right?
Right. So definitely more secure.
Yeah.
By default, also.
Yeah. Also by default. Yeah.
And what about scalability? It's an important part of today's products. Like every digital product is going to scale eventually.
Right.
So are we better off with Jamstack in terms of scaling?
Well, most likely, because most likely the things that are more often than not the user-facing parts of Jamstack are the static files, because this is the things that we pre-build. So everything that is getting served to the users is already static, and things and static files are incredibly easy and cheap to serve and scale, because we can just distribute them on the CDN and serve them, cache them indefinitely, and serve them in as much quantity as we want without any expensive computations needed. Most of the time, because usually you probably want some serverless functions also doing some work. Maybe you want to optimize some images, do some stuff as well, but yeah.
Right. So it's more scalable because
maybe not even more scalable, but it's much easier to scale, and it's much easier to scale very seamlessly, very automatically, because most CDNs are just respond super seamlessly to traffic increase. If you have 100 people requesting your site and 100 million people requesting your site, for CDN, it's not really that much of a difference in terms of performance.
Because the architecture is there already, and it's meant to, like, for this, CDNs are already meant to serve millions and millions and millions of people.
Well, yes, but the biggest part of it is just static files. There's nothing much more to it. It's like if you were to basically send everyone a text file. There's no work that any server has to do. No computations required. It's just. Yeah.
So if our product suddenly went viral, we would have no problems with scaling. It would auto scale basically.
On most CDNs, yeah. If you have a CDN in place already, you would only pay for the extra bandwidth that you use because it scales. But in terms of scaling, there would be no issue. Like 99.9% of the time.
So you mentioned it's also cheaper to host. Is it the case that the Jamstack applications are in general less costly? Is it true?
I mean, it would depend, because as we talked about before, the Jamstack apps are inherently combined of many different services.
Yes.
So I guess the sum of all the services that you're using might exceed the regular costs that you would use for a monolithic architecture solution. But it usually doesn't. The biggest problem with monolithic architectures is that once you're locked into them, and once you start paying for hosting and for scaling, you pretty much don't have that much room for optimizing things.
Right, and also I think that it's the case where we're delegating our critical tasks, like having content management system or authentication service, to companies that are absolutely top of the top in their specific domain.
That's one thing. But even in terms of, like, if we focus on purely the costs first, if you would to have like your product with Jamstack, even if it exceeds what you paid for WordPress and you're not fine with it, there's always room for optimizing it, right? So if we're paying even like 2 or 3x of what we paid before, we can look at, okay, what actually costs this much, okay, we're using a lot of money on the authentication service. Let's think about maybe what alternatives can we use. Maybe we can write our own because we don't need as sophisticated of a service as this is. Maybe
Right,
we can move to a different provider.
Okay.
And there's like a lot of room because we can optimize pretty much every single aspect. And if it's not optimizable, we can even swap it out for something else. There's like complete freedom in terms of this. So even if in pure cost, you might want to pay more because, as you said, you might gain the domain knowledge of many different providers. Because if you host everything by yourself, you're kind of responsible for everything, and you might have updates for different packages for different services, but it's in the end still you who's responsible for this. Whereas if you're using an authentication service to authenticate your users, you have companies with millions of dollars and hundreds of people behind them that do only security and make sure that no one gets unauthorized access inside.
So I would say that it's very cost effective using Jamstack because you're getting insanely good value to money ratio. Because if you're paying for CMS, then you're getting top quality in terms of money to value, but also you're not locked. So if you're not satisfied with your CMS, or if you're not satisfied with your authentication or whatever payments provider, you just swap it out easily.
Right. And you have a lot of freedom in terms of how much features and how sophisticated you want your solutions to be. Because as I said, if you want a super simple authentication solution, you can maybe host your own even still as a microservice,
and then you're reducing the cost as well.
And you're reducing the costs. But if you're like if the authentication is like the absolute core of your app and it has to be like absolutely top notch, maybe you're storing medical data, maybe someone is logging in with basically we have GDPR now as well. Right. So if those things are very crucial for you, you can basically use a provider that already exists on the market and that is most likely compliant with every single regulation that you need for your authentication.
Right. And last but not least, developers and development experience.
Right.
How does it work with Jamstack? Do developers like Jamstack?
So developing with Jamstack is very nice in terms of I guess there are many things to it. One thing is surely that when you develop, you only have to really care about one thing at a time. Because when you develop, when you focus on developing the front end, you only really need to care about the front end. You don't need to care about the fact that maybe some change that you do on the front end will somehow now break the integration with something or like affect some other system that's used here. Or I guess you can worry about it, but usually just interface with everything via APIs. So as long as you get proper API response and use it properly, you don't really have anything to worry about. And the same goes for other services. So if you develop a microservice for authentication, you only have to care about its API and that it stays the same between the versions, and you don't have to worry about affecting the front end in any way, right?
Right. So in general, it's a very good developer's experience.
It usually is because the tooling that also exists for it is very, very good. If we think about something like Next.js or Gatsby,
and the tooling is I think it's ever evolving. It's like super fast in terms of improvements.
Yeah, and I would say that it's definitely one of the best things about Jamstack for developers. Because with today's tooling, it's extremely easy to create products with Jamstack.
Okay, to summarize the 5 main benefits of using Jamstack, we have better performance because our apps are decoupled. We have more security. Again, it's a default state because everything is more decoupled.
Right.
And we're getting scalability that's unparalleled because everything is usually static files, and then we have CDNs that seamlessly compensate any spikes of users,
which is also the default.
And we're having really good developers experience,
which is also a
default because all the tools are evolving very quickly
and are made for developers.
And on top of all that, we're getting really good money to value ratio for everything we're building.
And most importantly, I think here is that we decide where the money goes, basically.
Right. So if we want to use a lot of money on authentication services, because that's one of the core.
Right. We don't have to throw all of our money into hosting of X solution, but we can throw it into authentication. We can throw it into CMS. We can throw it into anything we want.